I recently took a stroll over to Sacramento's cathedral, and of course, many people come here on Sundays or for high holidays, or sometimes just to seek a place of solace. And we're all pretty familiar with what a church looks like inside. The pews, the marble, the altar, stained glass and candles. But whatever the reason for coming to the church, hardly anybody comes to learn about the Romans. As a matter of fact, I remember growing up and attending the Stations of the Cross, which, for those of you who don't know, is a prayer that revolves around the various steps before Christ is crucified, died, and is buried, that are usually indicated in the church by large paintings depicting each scene. And in many of these scenes, you'll find that Romans are not the celebrated ones. They're the demonic figures that ultimately put Christ to death. But as a young child learning about these stories, in addition to also learning about history and mathematics, I was always struck by the fact that just below these depictions of Romans were Roman numerals. Scene by scene, many of them with Roman soldiers, Pontius Pilate, and below the Roman numerals prominently placed. But in these next two episodes, we're going to be surprised to find out that if you transported a Roman here today, the place that they would feel most comfortable would be in a Catholic church. And we're going to look specifically at Catholic sculpture in addition to the architectural design of a church and how they both have evolved from Roman art. Now, believe it or not, to fully understand Roman sculpture's effect on Catholic sculpture, we have to go way back before the Roman civilization. And we'll start with this sculpture here. It's a sarcophagus. It's made of clay, so it's terracotta. And you see two figures reclining. Now, this is from the Etruscans. And the Etruscans were located in central Italy, in modern-day Tuscany. As a matter of fact, the word Tuscany comes from for Enotria, the region of the Etruscans. Now, in addition to the Greeks, the Etruscans have a large influence on the Romans. And you can see geographically they're in the same area. So when we think about Roman art, it really is blending Etruscan and Greek. Now, why we're looking at this work is because there's something quite interesting happening here. So these two people would have been buried in this sarcophagus. But you can see they're not sleeping, but they're doing something peculiar. And if you take a look, this husband and wife couple, we presume, are using their hands. And the reason they're using the hands is because they're communicating with one another. They're talking. And as we all know, the foundation of any great relationship is communication. Now, we've only seen the use of hands before in the early votive Sumerian sculptures, where if you remember, these clay sculptures were clasping their hands together to give us the indication of prayer. But after that, hands become literally useless. If you think about the Egyptian pharaohs, hands were clasped to their sides or on their lap. The Archaic period and the Greek period mimicked the Egyptian work, and again, hands clasped. It's not until we get to the Etruscans that we have this revitalization and really the beginning of how hands are used in artwork throughout Western art history. And if you've ever been to Italy, it should come to no surprise to you that sculpture that originates in Italy has a couple communicating with their hands. You can walk the streets of Italy, Rome, Florence, any city or small town, and you know people are talking even if you can't even hear their words, but you can see their hands moving. You can tell if it's a love story or a friendly story, or one of anger and frustration. The hands are a sheer way of communicating the Italian experience. In time, just as the Etruscans begin to dissolve and the Roman Empire begins to grow, this statue emerges, and we see as the crystallization of these hand gestures with this, what we call Roman orator. We have a toga figured, which can be expected from a Roman, and then you have this hand raising up. And so for the Romans, communication was important because this is how you communicated your ideas. And if you need to convince a group of people who have this semi-democratic society, words and how you speak and how you lead are important. So the hand raised up, we can, even in these modern times, communicating with tablets and cell phones, can understand that the hand being raised up is one of somebody who is speaking, who is about to speak to a large crowd. One doesn't use a hand gesture like this just to speak to one or two people. This is someone who is speaking to the masses. And so we can presume that this person is someone of importance. For the Romans, someone who wore a toga was somebody who was of the upper classes, and particularly in the ruling class. And so the gesture with the toga really tells us something about this individual. And with this sleight of hand, art history has changed forever. One of the most important works from the early Roman Empire is a work that uses this hand gesture for both artistic and political reasons. This is Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and we can see clearly how the hand gesture is being used here. Now, it's not just a hand gesture for political reasons, but it's also expressing military reasons. Because you can see that he has a military garb on, he's got this armor on. He has the hand up as leading or about to speak. And also on the bottom foot here, we have this little cherub, this little angelic feature that kind of gives him a god-like presence. And so this is what we refer to as kind of Roman propaganda art. This isn't just a portrait of Augustus, but this is really something that is crafted to convey a political message. He is the one in charge. He is the one leading. He is the one communicating to us. Now, let's not forget this would have been brightly painted, and we know by now that the paint deteriorated over time. Now, to give this in addition to the hand and the armor and this angelic figure, if we look at the detail of his armor, you see this bearded figure with this kind of cloth being draped over his head. And this figure was Celios, who represented the heavens. And by having this little detail here, it is telling us that Augustus is the ruler on earth and in the heavens. And so you can see the mighty presence of this figure when you begin to dissect all these details and what the artist intends us to take away when we look at this. The official title of this work, an important work in art history, is called the Prima Porta. And you can see here, even if Emperor is on a horse, this equestrian sculpture of Marcus Aurelius, it's an important work because it's one of the only large-scale bronzes left from the Roman times. Most are melted down throughout history. But this was left intact. And what you can see is, even with him riding this big horse, having one hand on the reins, he manages to get that other hand up in a leadership role. Most political statues today of George Washington or Confederate memorials or memorials throughout Europe of somebody riding on a horse can trace back the style to this particular sculpture of Marcus Aurelius. The other unusual thing about this equestrian horse is that Marcus Aurelius has a beard. Now, he wasn't the first to have a beard. it was actually the Emperor Hadrian who introduced the beard as a fashion statement for Roman emperors and most Roman men. Now, beards were not of a fashionable thing to have as Romans because they thought that it would be considered a disadvantage on the battlefield. Somebody could grab your beard and pull you and then take control of you. Matter of fact, the word for beard is barba, and anybody who was outside of the Roman walls, primarily those in the north, were referred to as the barbarians, the bearded ones, which then over time meant those who were uncivilized or savage. Because Hadrian was more of a philosophical emperor who wrote poetry, books on philosophy, was known to be very interested in architecture, and some think he actually designed some aspects of the buildings he lived in. The beard took on this different type of idea, which was somebody who was wise or learned or a philosopher, if you will. Now, on Roman sarcophagi, these are boxes where people would be buried, much like the Etruscan sarcophagus we saw earlier with the couple talking with their hands. We can see that this philosophical idea spreads pretty quickly. Add that with a scroll being depicted in their hand, and you get this idea that it's a learned, well-read person who's thinking on the deeper meanings of life, which on a sarcophagus, which is where somebody's buried, would be a perfect symbol where somebody is thinking about what they've done over their life and really what the meaning of life is. In time, as Christianity begins to spread across the Roman Empire, Christians begin to gravitate towards this type of imagery. And so what we see is that these toga bearded figures with a scroll in their hand become central to Christian iconography or Christian symbols. Here you have a Roman sarcophagi of an individual who converted to Catholicism. And you can see here we have various symbols in addition to this toga bearded individual. We have on the left, the story of Jonah and the whale. In this case, the whale looks more like a dragon. You have on the far right the sacrifice of Isaac by his father Abraham. And then right there in the center, you have this good shepherd, a young individual with a sheep around his shoulders, which is a perfect symbol for Christ. But even this derives from classical work. If you remember back to our Greek sculpture of the smiling calf bearer, you can see how the pagan idea of sacrificing a calf or a lamb becomes a perfect symbol for Christ and his ultimate sacrifice of his own life, but also Christ as shepherd of all of us. And here is yet another Roman sarcophagus. This is definitely somebody who was much better off and much more important because you can see the play of Christian symbology with the classical kind of motifs. You see the arches, the pediment, the columns, all framing Christian symbols. We have here Abraham and Isaac. You have Adam and Eve. And in the center, you have Christ seated. Now, in the early days of Christianity, there was no Christ crucified, a symbol that most Christians recognize as the ever-present symbol of Christianity. Here we have a young, beardless Christ, and he's sitting down with his toga, a scroll in one hand, and the other hand would have been raised up in that kind of leadership position, which eventually gets to be interpreted as a blessing. So Christ blessing us. And this derives from images of Apollo, actually, the Greek and Roman pagan god who was often depicted quite young. He was the kind of antithesis of Zeus, who was bearded and older. Apollo was the kind of eternal youth, the symbol of one who never diminishes, never dies, is always amongst us. So you can see how the Christians borrowed from that. As a matter of fact, you can see here a seated, robed Apollo and how similar it looks to an early Christian sculpture of Christ, who's also seated and robed, both with similar hairdos, both very youthful, and both kind of powerful in their seated position. And if you look closely, it's seated on what looks like a bearded individual with a large kind of towel or drape clasped in one hand and arching over to the other. Now, if you've been listening, you can remember this little image was actually found also in the Prima Porta sculpture of Augustus on his armory, which symbolized Augustus as ruler of the heavens and earth. And here it fits perfectly with Christ, who's enthroned, seated on top, who's also the ruler of heaven and earth. Now that we've taken a look and understand the evolution of the use of hand in early Etruscan sculpture, how it evolved into Roman sculpture, the evolution of the beard, the toga, that philosophical look, the early Christian symbols that borrowed heavily from the Roman artwork. Let's go back to the cathedral in Sacramento and take a look at how the saints are depicted. When you walk up to the facade of the church, the face of the church, you can see several marble sculptures that any Roman would have felt comfortable looking at. Some are youthful, others are bearded. They have what look like togas, but they are clerical robes of monks, bishops, and priests. Some holding books for that philosophical look. All of them raising their hands in a show of blessing to those below. Going into the church, you see kind of more brightly covered sculptures, which would have felt even more familiar to Romans, because remember, Roman sculpture was brightly colored. And so, whether it be the sculptures or the stained glass or the images painted for the Stations of the Cross, you can see how a Roman would have felt at home in certain ways looking at these images. And even though it was of a different religion, a religion that emerged during the Roman Empire and ultimately led to part of its demise, the images found here would have been relevant in some way to Romans, reinterpreted for this new non-pagan religion of Catholicism.